a weekly news conversation in which we discuss Africa in the Western press and give you a breakdown of what our thoughts are. I'm your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is a journalist, a publisher, Black Star News, a writer, an author of How Manufacturing Hates, How the Media Demonized Africa. He's none other than Comrade Milton Allimadi, and his book, incidentally, inspired African News Review.
Asante
Welcome,
sana.
Comrade.
Asante. Thank you, comrade.
Yes. This Thursday, 12th of September 2024, marked the 47th anniversary of Steve Biko's assassination by the apartheid authorities. And before I get your thoughts, I want to read something from his book, I Write What I Like. And basically, it's his biological summary. Steve Biko was born in 1940, let me a second, 1946 in King Williamtown, Cape Province. He entered the non-European section of the Medical School of the University of Natal, Durban, in 1966. He joined the National Union of South African Students and was an active member until 1968 when he broke away to form the Black Community Program. These community development programs were a practical manifestation of the Black consciousness philosophy and inspired various projects such as the Zampilo Clinic and literary schemes. In 1973, the authorities banned him from speaking in public and publishing his writings. He was restricted to his hometown of King William. Despite this, he continued his political activities. In 1976, Steve Biko was held under the Section 6 of the Terrorism Act. He was kept in detention for several months and then released without charges being made. In 1977, Steve Biko was appointed honorary president of the Black People's Convention, an organization he had helped found in 1972. Later that year, he was again held under security legislation. He was taken to Port Elizabeth under detention and died there on 12 September 1977. The cause of his death was established as brain damage. He left a widow, Notisikelo, and two sons. May his path be smooth, as we will say. Brother
Correct.
Milton, your thoughts on
Well, of
Brother
course,
Biko?
Steve Biko, he was one of the great young leaders in South Africa. He became famous for leading the Black consciousness movement, which was very similar to in the diaspora in the US when they had the whole Black Pride movement. Black is beautiful. Because in South
Hmm.
Africa, very
Yeah.
similar to the US, centuries of demonization of African people had instilled a sense of inferiority complex amongst the Black African population. And Biko recognized that. And once they started talking about the Black consciousness movement, they started insisting that why should we let European so called liberals or progressive be at the ones who are at the forefront of the liberation struggle? We need to speak on our behalf for ourselves. And that's why he also parted from the National Student Union, which was led by European so called liberals. Why should we need intermediaries to plead on our behalf?
Hmm.
And of course, it took off, as they say, like wildfire, because young people realize he's right. Why do we need others to agitate on our behalf? We need to find our own battles. And the apartheid regime, of course, feared that because they knew Biko was right. They feared him for lifting the level of resistance by the young people who realized that they can actually do their own fighting. And of course, it led to much more dynamic resistance, including um, the uprising like Soweto uprising. You see, um, and Biko also was very prescient in terms of his warning. As you recall, he said, "If we think ending apartheid involves only changing the skin color of the rulers, then we are badly mistaken. If we don't address issues of power dynamics, economic control, control of the minerals of the country, of the factories, the production system." And he said, because if we do that, what will happen is a small black elite, the black bourgeois, will become very wealthy. And then the apartheid, in the new post apartheid era, the white power structure would use that to buffer. They would not need to address the needs of the millions, the masses. And that's exactly what
What is happening in
obtains
South
today
Africa?
in South
Yes.
Africa. So you could see today, even when he spoke in 1976. So we owe him uh, great respect. We honor his legacy and his lessons. His warning is being manifest today. South Africa, the a true transition in the post-apartheid era has not yet occurred, and eventually it will, because those truths cannot be challenged, and our people will not accept exploitation perpetually or permanently.
Thank you. Thank you. So, speaking of Black consciousness, we go for our first story, we go to Kenya. And the Kenyan court has suspended the news comes from Financial Times, and it reads the headline reads, Kenya court suspends Adani deal to run Nairobi's airport.
Mm.
And it goes, the lead says, the legal challenge is the latest blow to the Indians conglomerate's effort to expand overseas presence. Kenya's High Court has suspended a government plan to allow Indians Adani Group to manage the country's main airport, following intense local opposition, marking the latest setback to the conglomerate's overseas expansion. The court order on Monday temporarily blocks a government proposal to grant the infrastructure-focused company owned by Gautam Adani, India's second richest man, a 30-year lease to operate Jomo Kenyatta's International Airport. The Law Society of Kenya and the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, which petitioned the High Court, said the estimated 1.8 billion in funds needed to revamp the airport could be raised without a multiple decade leasing contract. I'll just end with this. The Kenya's airport authority said Adani's proposal to refurbish the facility and invest in a new terminal and runway was needed to spruce up the aging infrastructure at the largest airport in East Africa's most advanced economy. Your thoughts?
Okay, so my thoughts, probably they do need the financing,
Okay.
correct?
Hmm. So you're
Um,
siding with capital.
oh, definitely. You need finance to operate
Okay.
an airport.
Mm-hmm.
And given what's going on in Kenya right now,
Mm-hmm.
people are coming out on the streets. They've been out on the streets. We had the protests, which was intensified in June. As many as how many people? I think it was about 28 who were killed
Mm-hmm.
because they cannot bear the tax burden, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now you have an airport that also needs capital for renovation operation. You don't want an airport has to be one of the safest establishments you have in any given country. People don't want to hear that, because of financial issues, there's some issues that may compromise safety, measures at any airport in the world, correct?
Okay. Yes.
So obviously that's a priority. You're not going to be able to tax anymore because you saw what happened with the current tax alone. So
True.
forget about additional tax. So where is the money going to come from? And that's a tragedy. You're going to have to mortgage some of your resources. Otherwise, you shut down the airport. It may not meet international standards at some point, and you can't afford to do that because tourism is one of your main sources of revenue.
Okay.
So obviously, you need the airport to be operating. Uh, Trade, you are a big producer of what horticultural, the flower industry, and obviously That's something you can't ship in cargo container in ships. Those need to be flown. So airport is very critical to Kenya's survival. Here's my own take.
Okay.
This is their biggest mistake, and not only Kenya, most African countries, and particularly in East Africa. In East Africa,
Mhm.
they have not actualized the visions they had. And they knew what it took of the 1960s when they started with the East African community. The East African community is a shadow of what it could have been and should have been and still can be. So if the East African community had actualized the way it was envisioned, the cost of operating airports would be shared
Hmm.
amongst the three East African countries. And now you have more countries involved in East African community.
Yeah.
Now
Mhm.
you have Congo, you have Rwanda, all these countries that have been added to the East African community now, meaning you are splitting the cost. The burden is not just on one country. And that would apply to the post and the communications, you know, the harbor services, the railway services, you see? So you
Okay.
would not need to be prostituting your resources to outside financiers.
So
And
what
that's the
about
biggest
the
tragedy.
so what about
Yeah.
the sovereignty issue?
The sovereignty, I mean, because then I could that's something I can address very quickly. My question would be, which African country is sovereign? You
Mm.
see, it's not there. And that's when Nkrumah warned in neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, that we cannot exercise our sovereignty unless and until we unite. Because individually, we are not strong enough to withstand. You forget the countries. He said we cannot even withstand the corporations. Yeah, he said, look at Congo. He said in the past, we would identify whatever is going on in Congo with the European powers. Is it Belgium? Is it Britain? Is it the United States? He said, we don't even need that nowadays. Nowadays, the corporations, the companies are
Mm.
so powerful that they themselves, private companies, can undermine your sovereignty. You see? So I think anybody who says, oh, I'm protesting because this is mortgaging Kenya's sovereignty, and at the same time,
Yeah.
you know that you're not able to pay any more taxes, my question to them would be, where's the money going to come from to operate the airport? You see? Yeah?
So
Yeah,
what's the
that's a tragedy.
what's the
Well, this is what they could say. They could say, we can't give you a 30-year lease. That's out of the question.
okay.
We can do 10 years. But then now Adani is going to be saying, I cannot recoup my money within 10 years. That's
That
part of
10
what it
years.
says. So
Okay.
see, I don't know enough about the financing. I don't know what the revenue stream right now
Mhm.
in the airport. I don't know the cost of operation. But whatever it is, 30-year lease is unjustifiable because if we are criticizing China for all these, long-term leases, how can it be okay for India then, you see? So if you say, okay, structure it for a 10-year lease, and in the meantime, what I'm going to do in these 10 years is to make sure that we actualize the
Mm.
vision of the East African community. Meaning within 10 years, the cost is going to be spread out so that now Uganda does not have to carry the burden of Entebbe Airport
One
alone.
shot. Yeah. Yeah.
Tanzania does not have to carry Dar es Salaam. I think now it's Mwalimu Nyerere Airport alone. Same thing
Mm.
in Congo. Same thing in the other East African countries. Same thing in South Sudan, which is now a part of East African community as well. So that's what they can do. But right now, the money is going to have to come from somewhere. If it doesn't come from Adani, it's going to come from the World Bank. And they have their own conditionalities. So now
Yep.
you're probably comparing the deal from India with the deal from the World Bank and a possible deal from China. I myself, actually, philosophically speaking,
Mhm.
and this is where I support what Nyerere actually said in 1985, but I don't think the deal is structured the way Nyerere is thinking. Nyerere is saying we are not at the same stage of economic development, even though they say all of us are the so-called, in those days, they like saying the North
And
versus
the
the
South.
South, right?
Yeah.
The
Hmm.
global South. So Nyerere said, not all of us in the global South at the same level of economic development. So India, and in fact, at that time, China was not as developed as it is today. India, China, Brazil, they have technologies that can benefit countries like Tanzania, which we don't have. But we are always running, to Europe or Japan because our minds are conditioned that way, sort of a neocolonial dependency. So we
Mm.
need to increase intra South cooperation. So if this could be structured as one of those intra South cooperations, then I can see it working. But I suspect it's structured probably more similar to the way the World Bank does deals with African countries. And
Okay.
Nyerere would not approve of that. Nyerere
Okay.
would say, okay, if there's some goods that Kenya can generate to compensate for this kind of investment so that Kenya is not having to take loans to pay Adani or to tax its citizens more, then that's the kind of intra-South cooperation that, of course, I would support.
Now, you mentioned the extension of it to place the extension of the burden of carrying such airports to places
Mm-hmm.
like the Congo, which is where we're going next.
Mm-hmm.
Congo has now taken Belgium to court, and this is stemming from its experience during the colonial rule. And the
Yes,
story comes from Radio France International. It's
yes.
the headline reads: Belgium accused of colonial era crimes against
Mm-hmm.
humanity in Congo. Five
Absolutely.
mixed race women demanding reparations from Belgium after being taken from their mothers in Congo 70 years ago took their fight to a
Yeah,
Brussels appeal court on Monday. The women accused the countries of crimes against humanity over a colonial era practice that saw them taken from their families and placed in institutions.
right,
This pictures, okay, and the the description reads mixed race kids from the Katenda convent, Monique Bitu Bingi. And so he goes and names the names of the girls,
right,
wants to sue the Belgium state over their treatment in Congo.
right,
And we delve further. The complaint covers the period 1948 to 1961, 13 years, concerns the entire policy of placing mixed race children in a religious institution managed by the church, but which in fact resulted from a racial policy insaturated by the Belgian colonial administration in Congo. The Belgian authorities recognized that between 14,000 and 20,000 children were involved in this case, but despite their considerable number, their fate has long been ignored, according to Radio France International's correspondents in Brussels. In 2021, the judges rejected the motivation brought by the five plaintiffs, saying no one can be punished for a crime that did not exist at the time of the alleged facts. The women appealed the decision and a new trial opens on Monday. Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, no, this is a
Sad.
very, very, very tragic and very interesting case on very many levels. Okay, so
Mm.
what period did they say?
That is 1948 to 1961.
Okay. All right, so let me speak on a number of factors here. Okay. Number one, first of all, they said 20,000. That number is incorrect. Um, and then the period 1948, 1960 what? 61?
It was 1961.
Okay.
Yes.
So when was King Leopold establishing Congo
That
Free
was
State?
1850, 1855.
18 somethings, right? In the
Yeah, it went in
19
1855, but it was, you know, confirmed post the Berlin
Berlin.
Conference.
So
Yeah,
let's say 1890 is effective control.
yeah, yeah.
So you're telling me that these children were being made and birthed only beginning in 1948? What kind of nonsense is this? What about the ones who were birthed from the 1890s onward
Mm.
to 1948? What became of those? Unless you are admitting to me that those were being exterminated as soon as they were born.
Oh.
Otherwise, Where are they? Why should we not account for those crimes as well? So that's the first biggest glaring omission that we should, probably see. As I say, when you read European created content, read it from a Pan-African perspective and ask yourselves. So now I'm worried if many of our sisters and brothers did not notice that omission. Why do we let them establish the terms of the conversation? Because you should ask yourself, okay, did Congo become a Belgian colony in 1948? And the answer is no. So why are they selecting 1948 as the beginning point of the conversation and not 1890? Why? Because they want to limit liability. And that's why I said 20,000 is a low figure without even knowing what the true figure is. But I know that they were birthing children with African women, Europeans in positions of power, right? Having children from the 1890s onwards, even earlier than the 1890s, right? But
Yes.
1890s, let's take that. Or even let's take 1884, 85, when Africa was officially partitioned as the beginning point. So, okay. And they were saying that there's a quote there that at the time it was not a crime. Okay. So at one point, slavery was legal. Who today would still say that slavery was not a crime? So that's something you can demolish very quickly.
True.
So of course they deserve reparations. And this also speaks to European arrogance. Why is this even coming as a lawsuit? Why was this not settled a long time ago
Yeah.
by the European establishment in Belgium to say that this was a tragedy? Let's address it immediately so that it's a non-issue.
Well, the
Now,
judges
2024, we are talking about this issue. Think about that. That goes
well,
to European arrogance. And my final point is, then obviously I would like your own feedback.
okay.
My final point is this. So I like that Radio France International is making this a big story, and deservedly, it is a big story, right? But now the obvious question is, okay, what about France? And what about all those children who were similarly birthed by Frenchmen in their African colonies? What about Portugal?
Britain.
The same thing. What about the same thing? So there's a lot of accounting. And the reason why the case was initially dismissed is because this case will open up a Pandora's box.
Yeah.
If these 5 women succeed, lo and behold, we're going to have so many such cases like this going forward, and deservedly so. And then, of course, we should not stop there. We should go beyond that and address the crimes committed against Africans in other respects during the colonial era. So those would be my comments to this.
There is I just wanted to add, whilst you were touching on the point of at what point do you enter the conversation, we also have to add Germany into the mix. Germany has to come into the mix. Spain comes into the mix. But more
Absolutely.
importantly, of recent has been Japan, because
Yes.
minors also birth kids in the Congo, and those kids were denied Japanese recognition.
Interesting.
So
this thing is really big. This thing, so they're
it's
suppressing it
huge.
for the fear
Yes,
of what it
yes,
would do.
Yes. Because when I
But
picked
it's
this,
a very interesting story, and I'm glad RFI actually did it, which allows us to now even broaden the conversation beyond where they were hoping that it would be limited to.
yes, their case means, like you said, not only would it open a Pandora's box, it will be question of what sort of crimes took place. I mean, fine.
Absolutely.
We're looking at
Thank you.
5 recognized women who can voice their misgrievances.
Right. And that's fine, because that sometimes you have to start like that, and then it becomes like a sort of in US they call it class action. I'm sure they have similar provisions in the Belgian laws too,
So again, where if this opens a case, what about other colonial crimes? In within the context of the so-called
Yeah.
civilization mission, you're
Yeah.
then going to have lots of issues like this back and forth.
Yeah.
Then, I mean, I just,
No, no, and deservedly so. And it must be because we have been subsidizing. There's no reason why, and they've had a long time to make sure these questions were not being even raised today, if they've done the right thing. So you have the World Bank, you have the IMF, you have the WTO, you have the United Nations, right?
Mhm.
If the true agenda of these organizations was to equitably lift up the standard of living around the world, we would not be having this conversation today.
True, true, true.
But we have continued subsidizing the high standard of living of Europeans and Europeans, in the United States as well. So when I say Europeans, I include the United
The
States
United
and all that,
States, yeah.
no?
Hmm.
Because we were never compensated for the profits that were illegally, extracted from our parts of the world,
Hmm.
historically.
Yeah.
And even today, we continue subsidizing them by providing them with cheap, very valuable, but cheap raw materials in terms of the compensation that we get for it, while we buy their products,
Mm.
manufactured products, which they
Mm.
cannot manufacture without our resources. We
Yeah.
buy it at a grossly inflated cost. See, so we are still
At
subsidizing.
the detriment of our own people, our
Absolutely.
own.
The model that Rodney elaborated still applies today. How Europe underdeveloped Africa applies in the sense that how Europe continues to underdevelop Africa. And when you say Europe today, of course, then you include the United
You the
States,
United
you
States, yeah.
include even China,
Hmm.
you include the
Japan,
emerging, countries.
yeah.
Absolutely, Japan as well.
And yeah, for people who might be interested in furthering their knowledge, deepening in their knowledge with regards to this aspect of the stories, there are a couple of books here. So you could read Leopold's
Yes.
Ghost, which will lay the foundation for what transpired
Hmm.
in Congo. And also,
Yeah, give the author's name to
oh,
people that are
sorry,
not familiar.
it's Adam Hochschild's King
Right.
Leopold Ghost. In fact, I
So,
did 5 months ago. On this channel, I did 10 must-read books on Congo. So if you go back, you see I did an overview of the books and what sort of timeline they're looking at. Predominantly, there's subject matter which they focus on, because no one book can cover the Congo.
correct.
There's a lot has happened in the Congo.
Correct.
So, but if you want to read about the people, you could read Georges Nzongola Intalaje's book, A People's History, from Leopold to Kabila.
Yes.
This,
And
this,
and
in
I
fact,
can tell you he is very respected at
yes,
Howard University, which is
this
my
is where
home
you should
now,
start from.
because he taught here for many years.
Okay.
And when they saw that he wanted me to come here to do the PhD, when I got here, I was welcome because of Professor Ntalaja.
Professor Ntalaje, yes. So, um, we still, for our next story, we stay in Congo. And this time it's regarding, uh, again, grab for resources. There's been a coup. And again, this story comes from Associated Press and is titled Congo Courts Sentenced 3 Americans and 34 Others to Death on Coup Charges. The picture there shows the son of the leader of the coup who was killed in the middle. So his friend, Tyler Thompson Jr., Marcel Malanga, and Benjamin Ruben Zalman Pullen. Now, those 3 were American citizens, and the story reads, Kinshasa AP, a military court in Congo handed down death sentences on Friday to 37 people, including 3 Americans, after convicting them of charges of taking part in a coup plot. The defendants, who had included a Briton, Belgian, Canadian, and several Congolese, can appeal the verdict on charges that include terrorism, murder, and criminal association. 14 people were acquitted in the trial, which opened in June. Malanga's 21-year-old son, Marcel Malanga, who is a US citizen, and two other Americans were convicted in the attack. His mother, Brittany Sawyer, had said her son is innocent and was simply following his father, who considered himself president of a shadow government in exile. The other Americans were Tyler Thompson Jr., who flew to Africa, not to Congo, who flew to Africa from Utah with younger Malanga for what his family believed was a vacation, and Benjamin Ruben Zalman Poland, 36, who is reportedly to have known Christian Malanga through a gold mining company. Do you read anything in what you just heard? Something stood
Well,
out to me there.
well, to me, I, I very much doubt that they'll carry out the death sentence, especially not to the American nationals anyway. I
Why
think
not?
because I think they're valuable alive, much more valuable alive to the Congolese than
Okay.
executed.
Mm,
I think they wanted to make sure that there would be no chance of him, being alive was the senior Malanga,
mm,
who of course could have been arrested. I mean, when you have, a whole national army and you surround somebody,
mm.
you know, I don't think he could have. He's not like a Superman who can just fly away in the sky or something. So there's a reason why he was exterminated.
Taken out of the picture.
And then, yeah, because obviously they didn't want him to live to plot another day, you see. So by not taking out these three,
Mhm.
they knew that these three would never plot another day. So in other words, they're actually confirming what the mother of Marcel is saying, that these were impressionable young individuals, particularly her son. Of course, a 21-year-old is most likely going to follow whatever his father is telling him. And this is not to minimize, of course, the crime itself, which
Mhm.
they were carrying out, But it sort of actually confirms what the mother is saying, and that's the reason why they were not killed. And they were
Not
not killed,
killed
of course,
yet.
for another reason, because
Yeah.
they wanted them to provide more details about the operation as well. But if they were perceived as
Threats.
much more dangerous alive than the value of information that they would provide, they would have been exterminated. So that's why I say there's a likelihood that the State Department may send some words there and say, in the interest of showing that you are a compassionate leader and all that stuff, uh, maybe the death sentence should be commuted to life in prison, and then life in prison after several years, there could be a presidential pardon to show his magnanimity. You see, because to me, these individuals, if you look at the broader sense, do not present the kind of existential threat to Congo stability
Mm.
that Rwanda does. Rwanda is the big problem that Congo faces, not these four buffoonish coup plotters. I don't know what was really ailing the senior Malanga. If Congo is able to withstand
Mhm.
a regional power like Rwanda and still survive,
Yeah.
you're just going to come and get off some boat from across the river in Brazzaville and hope to seize to seize power. I could never figure what was, in this guy's mind. I think the enough stories have not yet materialized to
Mm.
examine the state of mind of the senior Malanga. But it seems to me that mentally he was not
He
very
was
healthy.
troubled.
Yeah, it seems he was not very healthy. So that's how my own view of this attempt. I think it was much more diversion than the real threat that Congo faces, which is from Rwanda and in Eastern Congo.
But
Unless
okay.
Kagame had given, the senior Malanga some vague promise that, you do this and we'll cover it from one zone. Otherwise, I can't see, the rationale behind that attempted coup. But on the other hand, I like the fact that the government in the Congo is showing those who would want to seize power by unconstitutional means that the government would take it very seriously. It's much more likely that the other nationals who have been convicted, who are not US citizens, there's a good likelihood that those could be executed.
Okay. Yeah, save the thought on the execution. And this is my take. I would ask the question, are we not learning from history if again you have, I'll give you an example. You remember, I think it was 7 years ago when another Western was operative by the name of Chris Mann took off from Harare to go and overthrow the government of Equatorial Guinea. And again, Equatorial Guinea, for those who don't know, sits on one of the largest oil deposits and gas deposits in the African continent, and decided, they were going to overthrow the government. And here is a guy, a British guy, who decides, planning with the son of the then former Prime Minister of Britain, Thatcher, who resides in South Africa, to do something similar. Although they never went as far as putting boots on the ground, but they were caught, with weapons and what have you. Again, he was put in prison, and again, he should have suffered the death penalty, but you know what happens? The government gets leaned on, and before you know it, they have this clemency. He's now back in Britain, writing books and what have you. So the point I'm driving with that is, if that is the constant refrain of, oh, we're going to pardon them, then they can go back and do movies, write books, and what have you. When they come in and they kill people on the ground, what is the deterrent to them?
Well, you actually answered my question, because in that case, they were not executed either, you see?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. There is it's almost a recurrent pattern. So it's
a recurrent
almost,
pattern because
we can do it.
These are very weak countries. They have no power in the bigger scheme of things. Congo is a very dependent country. If somebody from the State Department, they don't have to call President Tshisekedi directly, because that's, when Tshisekedi is called, it has to be presidential to presidential. But somebody from the State Department can call somebody in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and says, the White House has let us know that we would view your magnanimity very kindly. Tshisekedi is not going to have these things executed. I'm just being very honest and realistic. A lot of our power and sovereignty does not reside in Africa, unfortunately. That's the fact of the matter. Going by the laws of the country, yes, of course, they've been convicted of a serious crime, terrorism, treason, and if the penalty is execution, so be it. But in the total scheme of things, if the US does not want them to be executed, and I am guaranteeing you that the mother of Marcel has already had several meetings with her congressman or congresswoman and senator, right? And that senator has already probably sent an appeal to the State Department. And the State Department most likely has already reached out to the embassy, and the embassy has reached out to somebody at Foreign Affairs, And that's just the real thing. And of course, I don't know this to be factual, but just, in the scheme of how things work, I would not be surprised that an American mother whose son is caught in a situation in Congo, I would be shocked if she would not reach her legislative representative. And that, if she is able to persuade that representative will at least reach out to the State Department. And that's how these things work. And the longer we fail to exercise our sovereignty, the more would we have these kind of things. And you gave a very good example, you know. But I'm glad to see that these sort of interventions, we're seeing less of them today than in the 1960s, of course, when in the
Yes.
same Congo, you have Europeans. What was the famous guy called? Was it Bob
Uh,
Donnard? Or,
Bob Denard, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
the Scottish or Irish, soldier of fortune. They gave them these colorful names,
Ben
coming
O'Hare.
with European mercenaries from South Africa, and managed to actually, with U.S. and CIA support, of course, crush the people who are fighting on behalf of Lumumba, his supporters, after he'd been killed. So those kind of interventions now, we don't see those anymore. So this kind of intervention was sort of like trying to turn back the clock as well, uh, quixotic, or back to the 1960s, sort of. But if there's
Yes.
any interesting, to me, any interesting dimension involved here, then it's going to be what can Congo get out of not executing these three. I think executing these three um, is not so much of an effective deterrent
Okay.
than executing those who are causing the horrific atrocities in Eastern Congo. I think
Mm.
those probably deserve, even though I'm not a big believer in the death penalty, I think those are the ones who really would deserve it, the ones who are committing those horrific crimes in Kivu, um, just
Kisangani.
unbelievable,
Yeah.
raping women with
Impunity.
solid instruments, committing massacres, just so they can steal the resources. Uh,
Hmm. I
those are the
mean,
ones who deserve no pardon at all.
so Comrade
And
Milton mentioned going back to the 60s when things used to be different. And this is the story, you could read more. And this is the story of Katanga,
right,
1960 to 1963. And the lead there says mercenary spies and the African nation that wage war on the world. In fact, that was Belgium's way of breaking up Congo and laid the foundation for the problems we currently have, where certain parts of
right,
the country are intractable with, you know, outsiders poking their nose from time to time to disturb the relative peace that is on the ground, you
correct.
know. And now
Yeah,
in
these are bank robbers. These are
y-
bank robbers because as what was the famous American bandit, and when they ask him, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is.
mm,
Yeah. Why are they causing the instability and crimes in Eastern Congo?
mm,
That's where the mineral resources are.
yep. Speaking of mineral resources, you could also read Leo Zelig's The Congo, Plunder and Resistance.
Hmm.
Again, so we hope you're listening, liking. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And also pass it on to those you think might be interested in knowing more about the great continent that is Africa. Now, on to our next story, which again, there's a bit of Congo in it, but
Hmm.
again, now we're coming out to New York, and the story reads: the UN, the United States, is not against. And this story comes from the New York Times. The Grey Lady. The United
Hmm.
States backs Africa's UN Security Council bid with a catch. The announcement provides US support to permanent council seats for African nations, though not new veto powers. But the path to adding members requires far more than White House approval. And this is the part that stood out to me. The Security Council has 15 members, 5 of which have permanent seats with veto power: the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France. The other 10 members of the Council rotate every 2 years. Adding any new permanent members will require the approval of all 5 permanent members and changing the UN Charter, a dim prospect given the divisions amongst the members, adding only African countries as permanent members will likely get pushback from other countries, including Japan, Brazil, India, Germany, and Italy. For years, those nations have lobbied for seats, arguing the world have evolved since the aftermath of World War II, when the world bodies were founded. Miss Thomas Greenfield, who happens to be the US ambassador to the United Nations, may also be considering her legacy at United Nations as a term possibly draws to an end, with the American elections looming in November and the likelihood that a new administration will appoint a new ambassador. During her tenure, she had made Africa a priority of her diplomacy. Laugh, laugh. Frequently traveling to the continent. And yeah, Mrs. Greenfield said on Thursday that United Nations will support the expansion of the Security Council permanent membership to include not only African members, but also a rotating seat for small island states. Her announcement, however, came with a significant catch. The White House did not back providing new permanent members with the same veto powers to block resolutions that the current 5 permanent members have. I have my reservations, but you go first.
Okay, well, this is the way it's structured. If they are not to have any veto power, then there's no purpose in having them in the Security Council. What difference would an expanded Security Council serve then? If they have no impact on veto,
True.
they cannot bring any super special intellectual argument or framework or analysis that cannot be provided by the non-permanent members.
Yeah.
They cannot bring any unique intellectual discourse that cannot be provided by their regular ambassadors to the UN, which they already have. You know,
Yes.
you have what, 54 ambassadors there?
54,
So
yeah.
why do you need, if there's no veto, why do you need any of them to be, why not just leave the rotating Security Council? Why not just leave the 15 members the way it is right now?
True.
You just want you want the superficial prestige to say, oh, we have
I am a member
permanent,
of the...
you know, we are always going to be there in the room when the conversation, when they have the conversation, we will be there, even though we will contribute nothing. That's what it sounds like to me. So it's utter nonsense. Of course, the veto is a form of apartheid, you know.
Yeah.
It's backward, it's completely apartheid. And of course, it was absolutely racist, you know, until China got on board. And China, of course, got on board because it was African countries in the General Assembly that got China to replace Taiwan as a member of the United Nations because the seat was previously
held by Taiwan. Yeah.
occupied by Taiwan. And then when China came on board, I mean, Taiwan was expelled and China came on board. And without China having been brought in, China never would have been a permanent member of the Security Council. So China actually owes Africa. And China, of course, supports Africa being on the Security Council, but being on the Security Council without a veto makes no sense. To me,
correct.
all the countries, no country should have veto power, because then it would be based, of course, on the majority vote, and that is what they want to prevent, because the more majority vote would be the countries that were previously exploited, colonized, and demonized, and of course that's what they want to avoid. And they're confirming that by telling you that, yes, we'll let you in the house, but we won't give you veto. You know, and it's so ironic that they have an African woman, you know, an African descendant who is propagating this Eurocentric notion, you know. That's
speaking of what you just said now, I'm going to read a part from Gerard Horne's White Supremacy Confronted. It says, is a huge book,
Mm.
and it's a part about what Miss Thomas Greenfield is saying. The White House did not back providing new members with the same veto power to block resolutions that the current 5 members have.
Mm.
And this is from President Eisenhower's White House. President Eisenhower remarked parenthetically that he was having a continual protocol discussion with the State Department, which insisted that he invites half a dozen American Negroes to any White House reception of a distinguished African visitor. The gesture would not only engender heartburn in Salisbury and Pretoria. Salisbury is now known as Harare,
Right.
And Pretoria, South Africa. Thus, it was during this troubled era that during a briefing for a US officials in Nairobi, the opinion was uttered that people of tropical Africa, potential slaves until a few decades ago, were still ill-fitted psychologically, sociologically, economically, and by education to undertake any country's responsibilities. So if that's kind of understanding still holds in 2024, it means we've not really moved from that mindset.
Absolutely. And of course, that kind of mindset does not affect only Europeans or European Americans. It affects, even African descendants as well. And also, now that you're bringing up that past, it's there's almost something which is almost comical. In the Nixon Papers,
Yeah.
and people who are interested, you can go online and read Nixon Papers. I think some of them are available in audio as well. There was one Nixon paper where Nixon was complaining to Kissinger. And it's so ironic that you have Nixon, this Republican, who of course was driven out because of the Watergate scandal as
Yep.
president, had to resign.
Hmm?
He said, I don't understand these African countries. And Kissinger was saying, why? Nixon said, I'm really tired of having to meet with all these ambassadors. Every other week, there's some new ambassador coming to present credentials. He said, why don't they just unite and have one African country so I can meet with one ambassador? So imagine Nixon making such a reasonable suggestion. And in his case, of course, his intention was just very selfish.
Selfish, because
He wasn't
he
really
was
saying,
tired of
we
shaking
need
hands.
a United States of Africa so Africa can be powerful. No, he was saying, because then I would just have to meet with one ambassador.
That is.
So you had Nixon actually advocating for United States of Africa, which of course I bring this up to say that if we had a United States of Africa, we would have a seat, a permanent seat, number one. Number two, we would have veto power, because we would say, if we don't have veto power, no uranium for you, no cobalt, no copper, no coltan, no gas, no petroleum. That's what we would say. And they would say, oh, yes, yes. In fact, we'll give you 2 seats and 2 vetoes.
With all the powers in the world.
But the way we are constituted today, the proof is in what she said. Yes, we might give you, a seat, but no veto. Why? Because you don't matter. It's amazing.
And
they say things that are not even supposed to say, and they say it unconsciously. And then when you deconstruct it, you realize she's saying, we'll give it to you, but it really won't matter because you won't be able to.
You won't be able to upstage whatever it is.
Absolutely,
we decide we
because
want to
you have no power. So we are doing it just out of the pleasure of our heart, just to tolerate you.
Exactly.
Because every time we meet you, you are bringing up this conversation. What about our permanent seat? What about okay. Here, take that seat, but keep quiet. And you keep quiet by not having a veto.
Speaking of the UN, there was a book written 3 years ago, actually, titled "A Dialogue of the Deaf: Essay on Africa and the United Nations," edited by Adekeye Adebanjo and Helen Scallon. It's very, very instructive on Africa's, the UN's role in Africa. And also, there is a very sizable chapter here on Haiti. And I love the way they wrote it because they incorporated Haiti into the African conversation,
Very good.
going into the upstaging of Aristide's government, flying him off into the Congo, and, just sort of saying, listen, we know you're having conversations, but
Mm.
it's basically, like you said, why would you welcome someone to a party, to the table, and not give them a plate to serve themselves? You know. So again, or Vijay Prashad's A History of the CIA, Washington Bullet's A History of the CIA, Coups and Assassination. He also talks about the structuring of the United Nations and how, forget the idea of I can't. Okay, yeah. Forget the idea of quote unquote security, a seat on the security permanent security council, because the way the UN is structured, following the Bretton Woods Agreement, Africa was never in the picture and would never be in the picture.
Right. So, in fact, they said Brazil, India, Japan, Germany have also all been demanding
Mm,
for a seat in the Security Council, of course.
yeah,
And when they demand seats, they're not talking about a seat without veto power,
yeah.
right?
Hmm.
That's not what they're envisioning. And out of all of these, in fact, Africa would actually have a better chance, even the Gulf countries, the Arab countries, the Gulf countries that have a lot of oil. If they said, okay, remember the boycott,
Yeah,
oil boycott
oil
over your
boycott.
policy in the Middle East on Israel and the Palestinians, that's when we exercise our might. So we now really want a permanent seat on Security Council, and we will use our uh, oil politics to secure that seat.
Hmm.
In terms of bargaining, leveraging resources, Africa is in a better position than those countries because, in addition to oil, we have all the other minerals that I elaborated earlier. All they have is oil. We have oil plus, you see. So if it came to like, squeezing them using our resources as the bargaining chip, we are in a much better position. But at the same time, we are in the weakest position because politically, we are much more disorganized, we are disunited than all those other countries. That is why a tiny country like Israel can demand have a much more bigger impact on global affairs uh, than the entire African continent. Well, one might say, okay, but Israel, is because of the support that it has from the United States. Well, that is
Hmm.
true. But can you imagine if Africa was a United States of Africa, and Africa, when it came to Middle East issues, decided to be on the same page with China and with Russia? You see? So, in fact, we are allowing the prolongation of these inequities in the Middle East
Hmm.
by our disunity. We are not only holding back Africa, we're holding back, large parts of the world as well.
Speaking of
And I don't need to elaborate further. Look at what one foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, was able to impact,
hmm,
and that's for one African country, South Africa, albeit with a much more developed economy. So imagine if South Africa was part of the United States of Africa. Just imagine the kind of impact we would have.
so playing the devil's advocate based on the framework of what Africa is at the moment, who would
Mm,
you legislate, or going by what the New York Times was writing there, who would
mm.
you consider to be members of the
For the
permanent
permanent,
security? Yeah.
well, South Africa. I think South Africa deserves it by the intervention
Hmm.
which was made, although that was prior to the uh, the party of apartheid coming into government in partnership, with the African Union. but the historical fact is that they made that major intervention, and they deserve it. At one time, I would have said Nigeria, but Nigeria has been missing in action for a
Ouch.
very long time now.
Okay. Speaking of missing in action, for our last story, we go to Tunisia. And this comes from the UK's newspaper, The Guardian, and it's titled EU Fears for its Human Rights Credibility as Tunisia Crosses Dissent. Leak shows. The lead says documents detailing deterioration under Kais Saied will fuel concerns about the bloc's migration deal with his country. The EU fears its credibility is at stake as it seeks to weigh growing concerns over the crushing of dissent in Tunisia while preserving a controversial migration deal with the North African country, according to a leaked document. An internal report drafted by the EU diplomatic service, seen by Guardian, details a clear deterioration of the political climate and a shrinking civic space under the Tunisian President Kais Saied, who has suspended parliament and concentrated power in his hands since starting his term of office in 2019. EU officials expect Saied to remain in power after presidential elections on 6th of October. The build-up to the vote has been marked by jailing of opponents and the prosecution of dissenters under the pretext of spreading false information. Sounds familiar?
Yeah. I mean, I have no particular special interest in this racist Tunisian president, he's and the sad thing is that the EU is they talk about partnership in crimes against humanity that have been committed by Africans,
Yes.
from south of the Sahara. It's amazing that this article that in fact should be the lead, of course, but that's sort of like just mentioned toward the end. His racist statements, and then there's no elaboration by what he actually did. The rounding up of
Black Africans,
of fellow human beings,
and dumping them in
the desert somewhere.
In the desert, pregnant women.
And if you're doing that, then I'm willing to believe that there are many boats that were deliberately sunk to drown them. If you're willing to toss them to die in the desert, then of course I truly suspect you have been drowning, them in these boats as well, and that needs to be investigated. That to me is a much more interesting story than the EU, and I like the way they massage the headline and the lead. It is meant to divert from the culpability of the EU
to push away from
against humanity. So the story now becomes EU
about
credibility. So you're supposed to suspend your critical analysis to suspect that the EU has credibility. How can you have any credibility when you are aiding and abetting somebody who's committing literally a type of genocide against Black Africans?
And he suspended parliament since 2019.
Suspended parliament since 2019, and you're working with him. Imagine one of the EU countries suspending parliament.
Parliament, exactly.
Hello? So the hypocrisy.
And you're still talking about your credibility.
The hypocrisy is outrageous. And that goes back to how we started this conversation. Read everything from an Pan-African perspective. Don't let them lure you deaf and blind into accepting the context, the framework that they set up, right? Because now you're reading, in the back of your mind, you're still convinced that, the EU does has credibility.
Yeah.
And now you're trying to analyze, how is that credibility being challenged here? When you should be starting by saying, no, the only credibility they have is that they credibly aided and abetted in genocide against Africans.
It's shocking. It sometimes when I read the Western press,
they're good at what we do. We've already admitted that. They're very good at what they do. The propaganda, they're brilliant,
when you read their press, they start off by first and foremost creating a distance, a buffer between
Yes.
I mean, it's not really a buffer, but it's almost like a psychological buffer with words by us, them, and then you begin to wonder, like, what are you doing?
Right.
You've been
But
working with
because they
this
want
guy.
you to suspend your critical judgment. And once you
Yes.
do, you're finished.
You've been working with this guy since 2019. And now
Think about
all
it.
of a sudden.
And now you're talking about credibility.
All of a sudden, you get a prick of conscience. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. But
I think it's possible that they know, and they also let in something that they think he's going to continue as president.
Yeah, 6th of October.
Even though he should not, right?
Yes. And they will continue working with him. As
exactly.
long as
They're
stops,
preparing you for that, you see? But they know that the outcry might become much more intense when that happens.
Yeah.
Right? So they want to start preparing the ground.
Yeah.
But, oh, no, we were actually, you see, we were criticizing him already.
Yeah.
But
still, as long as it stops migrants from coming to Greece or to the larger Europe,
we're fine with that.
Then we're fine with it. Speaking of Greece,
105 million euros in 2023. They're telling us in the story
for services rendered. Anyway.
Yeah. In fact, a clever young lawyer should take the EU to court. What is it called? I think it's called the European Court of Human Rights, right? Or something.
Yeah.
Over aiding and abetting in the extermination of Black Africans. And say without the 105 euros, the government would not have the resources or even the inclination, would not even dare do something like that. So the families of those who perish should be compensated by the EU. I think that's actually a lawsuit that might gain some traction.
Yes, on that just note, we've come to the end of another episode, and thank you all for coming through, for our listeners. And yes, if you want to have the audio version should be available on all platforms tomorrow. And yes, we hope to have this conversation again next week, hopefully with other news, but they keep giving. The Western press is Christmas father that keeps giving gifts. And again, we have to thank Comrade Milton Allimadi for coming through. And yes, any final words?
Luta continua.
Yeah, Victoria Seta. And from me, until next week, it is see you later, Odibakono.